The Soviet Union was built on the promise of a workers' paradise, a society where the collective good would triumph over individual ambition, where the state would guide its citizens toward a radiant future. But beneath this ideological veneer lay a darker reality, one in which the very citizenship that bound people to the Soviet state could be stripped away with a stroke of a pen. From the earliest days of Bolshevik rule until the final years of the USSR, forced expulsion and the abrogation of citizenship served as powerful weapons against those who dared to challenge the system. This was not merely administrative procedure. It was political repression dressed in legal language, a form of exile that severed individuals from their homeland, their families, and their identity. Today, the Russian Constitution explicitly forbids the deprivation of citizenship. Article 6 enshrines this principle, making it impossible for the state to cast out its own people. But for 7 decades under Soviet rule, no such protection existed. The state could decide, often arbitrarily, that certain individuals were no longer worthy of being called Soviet citizens. The consequences were devastating, not just for those expelled, but for the very idea of what it meant to belong to a nation. The legal foundation for these expulsions was laid remarkably early. In 1921, just 4 years after the October Revolution, the Council of People's Commissars passed a decree that would set the template for decades of political persecution. The decree concerned itself with the abrogation of citizenship rights of certain categories of persons living abroad. On its surface, the law appeared administrative, almost mundane. It targeted those who had held citizenship in the Russian Empire but had remained outside Soviet territory for more than 5 years, without registering with Soviet missions. It also stripped citizenship from anyone who had served in foreign armies or police forces. The rationale seemed clear enough. The new Soviet state needed to define who belonged and who did not, to draw boundaries around its revolutionary project. But the implications went far deeper. This decree established a precedent that would echo through Soviet history. Citizenship was not an inalienable right, but a privilege that could be revoked when the state deemed it necessary. By 1928, the scope had already expanded. Soviet embassies in various countries began compiling lists of individuals engaged in what they termed anti-Soviet activities. That year, 16 people across different nations found themselves stripped of their citizenship by decree. The machinery of expulsion was being refined, the bureaucratic processes smoothed out. What had begun as a measure to deal with émigrés from the Civil War era was transforming into something more sinister, a tool for silencing dissent, no matter where it originated. The 1930s brought further evolution. In 1938, the law on citizenship of the USSR formalized the process, making it possible to deprive someone of their citizenship either through court decision or by decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet. The dual mechanism was significant. Courts at least offered the pretense of due process, of evidence and argument. But the Presidium operated in the shadows, making decisions based on political calculations rather than legal standards. By 1958, even the judicial path was eliminated. Citizenship stripping became purely a matter of political will, removed entirely from any legal oversight. It was now an instrument of state power, wielded without constraint. The most famous victim of this system was also one of its architects. Leon Trotsky had been among the founding fathers of the Bolshevik Revolution, a brilliant orator and military strategist who had organized the Red Army and led it to victory in the Civil War. But in the power struggle that followed Lenin's death, Trotsky found himself outmaneuvered by Joseph Stalin. The contest between these two titans was not merely personal, it represented fundamentally different visions for the Soviet future. Trotsky advocated for permanent revolution, for spreading the communist project internationally. Stalin championed socialism in one country, consolidating power at home before exporting revolution abroad. By 1927, Stalin had won. Trotsky was expelled from the Communist Party, his influence shattered. The following year, he was exiled to Alma-Ata, the remote Kazakh city far from the centers of Soviet power. Stalin offered Trotsky an informal ultimatum: cease all political activity, fade into obscurity, live quietly in internal exile. For a man like Trotsky, this was impossible. He continued to write, to organize, to challenge Stalin's authority. The response was predictable. In February 1929, Trotsky, his wife Natalia, and their son were escorted by state security officers to Istanbul. They were deposited in Turkey, cut off from the Soviet Union but not yet formally severed from it. That final break came 3 years later. On February the 20th, 1932, the newspaper Pravda published a decision signed by Mikhail Kalinin, chairman of the Presidium of the Chief Executive Committee. The decree announced that Leon Trotsky and his family were stripped of Soviet citizenship for counter-revolutionary activities. The man who had helped create the Soviet state was now officially cast out from it. Trotsky would spend the rest of his life in exile, moving from Turkey to France to Norway, and finally to Mexico, always pursued by Stalin's long reach. In 1940, an assassin wielding an ice axe ended his life in a suburb of Mexico City. The expulsion had been both symbolic and practical. It marked Trotsky as an enemy of the state, while making it impossible for him to return and rally opposition. The pattern established with Trotsky would repeat throughout Soviet history, though the targets and methods evolved. The 1970s brought a new wave of expulsions, this time aimed at writers, artists, and intellectuals whose work challenged the ideological orthodoxy of the Brezhnev era. Among them was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a man whose trajectory from loyal communist to exiled dissident encapsulated the contradictions of the Soviet system. Solzhenitsyn had been a true believer. Born in 1918, he came of age during Stalin's rule, absorbing the revolutionary ideology that permeated Soviet education. He dreamed of becoming a writer and enrolled in the literature department of an institute in Moscow just before World War II erupted. When Germany invaded in 1941, Solzhenitsyn eagerly enlisted, serving as an artillery officer on the front lines. But even as he fought for the Soviet Union, doubts began to creep in. In letters to a friend, he criticized Stalin's conduct of the war, questioning decisions that had cost countless Soviet lives. Those letters, intercepted by military censors, sealed his fate. In 1945, just as victory in Europe was being celebrated, Solzhenitsyn was arrested. The charge was anti-Soviet agitation. The sentence was 8 years in the Gulag, followed by 3 years of internal exile. The labor camps transformed Solzhenitsyn. He witnessed the brutal machinery of Soviet repression firsthand, saw innocent people ground down by a system that valued ideology over humanity. When he was finally rehabilitated in 1957, during Khrushchev's thaw, he carried with him a mission: to document what he had experienced, to bear witness to the millions who had suffered and died in Stalin's camps. His first major work, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, was published in 1962 with Khrushchev's personal approval. It was a sensation, offering Soviet readers their first officially sanctioned glimpse into the Gulag system. But the thaw did not last. When Leonid Brezhnev consolidated power in 1964, the brief period of cultural openness slammed shut. Solzhenitsyn's subsequent works were banned from official publication. He refused to be silenced. His manuscripts circulated as samizdat, self-published typescripts passed hand to hand among the intelligentsia. He became increasingly bold, increasingly public in his criticism of the regime. The KGB monitored him constantly, attempting at least once to poison him. In 1970, the Swedish Academy awarded him the Nobel Prize in Literature, a decision that enraged Soviet authorities. Here was international recognition for a man they considered a traitor, a platform from which he could criticize the USSR to the entire world. The Soviet leadership faced a dilemma. They could arrest Solzhenitsyn, put him on trial, send him back to the camps. But he was now internationally famous, protected by the spotlight of global attention. A public trial would generate embarrassing publicity, would give him a platform to air his grievances. The alternative was expulsion, removing him from Soviet soil without the spectacle of a trial. When Solzhenitsyn declined offers to leave voluntarily, the decision was made for him. In early 1974, the highest levels of Soviet power convened to discuss his fate. The conclusion was unanimous: strip him of citizenship and deport him immediately. On February 12, 1974, KGB agents arrived at Solzhenitsyn's home. He was arrested, taken to Lefortovo prison, and within hours was on a plane to West Germany. He had been given no choice, no opportunity to prepare. His wife and children remained behind, though they would eventually be allowed to join him. The Soviet state moved swiftly to erase his presence. Published copies of his works were destroyed, his name removed from literary histories. It was as if he had never existed. Solzhenitsyn settled first in Switzerland, then in the United States, where he lived in rural Vermont. From exile, he continued his work, publishing The Gulag Archipelago, his massive 3-volume history of the Soviet camp system. The book, smuggled out of the USSR in manuscript form, became one of the most devastating indictments of communist totalitarianism ever written. Only in 1990, as the Soviet Union crumbled, was his citizenship restored. He returned to Russia in 1994, living his final years in Moscow until his death in 2008. Not all expulsions involved writers and political dissidents. Some targeted individuals whose defiance was more personal than ideological, whose conflicts with the Soviet system stemmed from character rather than conviction. Viktor Korchnoi was such a figure. Born in 1931 in Leningrad, he became one of the greatest chess players in Soviet history, a grandmaster who dominated national championships and competed at the highest levels of international play. Chess was more than a game in the Soviet Union. It was a Cold War battlefield, a demonstration of Soviet intellectual superiority. The state invested heavily in training players, supporting them materially while demanding absolute loyalty in return. Korchnoi was brilliant but difficult, impulsive and outspoken in a system that valued conformity. In 1966, according to his own account, Soviet authorities suggested he voluntarily give up his citizenship. He refused, a decision he would later describe as costing him 11 years of a good life. The real crisis came in 1974, when Korchnoi faced Anatoly Karpov in a candidates match to determine who would challenge Bobby Fischer for the World Championship. The match took place in Moscow, and the atmosphere was poisonous. Karpov enjoyed the full backing of Soviet sports authorities, while Korchnoi was treated as an outsider. Paid supporters filled the hall, applauding Karpov enthusiastically while greeting Korchnoi's moves with hostile silence. The psychological warfare was blatant, designed to unsettle him. Korchnoi lost the match, but his real transgression came afterward. He publicly criticized both Karpov and the Soviet Sports Committee, airing his grievances in the Yugoslavian press. This was unforgivable. The response was swift. He was banned from traveling outside the USSR for a year. When the ban was lifted, Korchnoi accepted an invitation to a tournament in the Netherlands. Once there, In July 1976, he requested political asylum. It was granted, and he eventually settled in Switzerland. 2 years later, in 1978, the Soviet authorities formalized what had already become reality. Korchnoi was stripped of his citizenship with a statement noting that he had systematically committed acts incompatible with his citizenship of the USSR, and by his conduct damaged the prestige of the state. The language was revealing. His crime was not espionage or treason in any traditional sense. It was the act of defiance itself, the refusal to play the role assigned to him. Even after citizenship was restored to many dissidents in 1990, Korchnoi refused to reclaim Russian citizenship officially, though he did return for occasional chess tournaments. He died in Switzerland in 2016, never having fully reconciled with his homeland. The poet Joseph Brodsky represented yet another variation on this theme. Born in Leningrad in 1940, Brodsky was a brilliant, unconventional poet who rejected the strictures of Soviet literary culture. In 1964, he was put on trial for social parasitism, a catch-all charge used against those who did not hold official employment. The trial was a farce, but it made Brodsky internationally famous. After serving 18 months in internal exile, he returned to Leningrad and continued writing, his work circulating in samizdat. By the early 1970s, the authorities had decided he was more trouble than he was worth. In 1972, Brodsky was forced onto a plane to Vienna, effectively expelled without the formal process of citizenship revocation that would come later. He settled in the United States, teaching at various universities and continuing to write poetry of extraordinary power. In 1987, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. Like Solzhenitsyn and Korchnoi, Brodsky had his citizenship restored in 1990, but he never returned to Russia. He died in New York in 1996. These famous cases were merely the most visible examples of a much broader phenomenon. During the entire Soviet period, dozens of dissidents, writers, philosophers, filmmakers, and artists were stripped of their citizenship. The reasons were often identical. Their work, their statements, their very existence contradicted the ideological line of the Communist Party. The process was frequently conducted in absentia, targeting individuals who had already left the country for work or travel. By revoking their citizenship, the state ensured they could never return, could never reunite with families or reclaim property. It was exile enforced through bureaucratic decree, punishment without trial. The legal framework continued to evolve. In 1978, a new law on citizenship codified the practice. Article 18 stipulated that citizens could be deprived of their citizenship for actions that denigrate the high rank of a citizen of the USSR and damage the prestige or national security of the country. The language was deliberately vague, offering no clear standards or definitions. What constituted denigration? Who decided what damaged prestige? As researcher Elena Ponizova has noted, such formulations opened the door to complete arbitrariness, allowing state agencies and officials to assess citizen behavior according to political expediency rather than legal principle. The law provided a veneer of legality while permitting virtually unlimited discretion. The human cost of these policies extended far beyond the individuals directly affected. Families were torn apart, children separated from parents, spouses forced to choose between following their exiled partners or remaining in the only home they had ever known. Those who left faced the trauma of displacement, of building new lives in foreign countries while knowing they could never return. Those who stayed lived under constant surveillance, their associations with expelled relatives marking them as politically suspect. The psychological toll was immense, creating a climate of fear that extended far beyond the relatively small number of people formally expelled. Everyone understood the message. step out of line, challenge the system, and you too could be cast out. The end of this system came only with the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. During the Gorbachev era, as glasnost and perestroika began to dismantle decades of repression, the question of citizenship stripping came under scrutiny. On August 15, 1990, President Mikhail Gorbachev signed a decree titled "On Cancellation of the Decrees of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR on Deprivation of Citizenship of the USSR of some persons residing abroad." The decree was sweeping in scope, restoring citizenship to virtually all persons who had faced such politically motivated persecution between 1966 and 1988. It was an acknowledgement, however belated, that these expulsions had been unjust, that the state had overreached in its efforts to silence dissent. But restoration of citizenship could not undo the damage. Years and decades had been lost. Solzhenitsyn returned to Russia, but many others, like Brodsky and Korchnoi, chose to remain abroad, their lives having taken root in new soil. The families destroyed by forced separation could not be reassembled simply by reversing a bureaucratic decision. The psychological scars remained, the knowledge that one's own government had been willing to cast them out, to declare them enemies for the crime of thinking differently. The legacy of Soviet citizenship stripping extends beyond the individuals directly affected. It represents a fundamental question about the relationship between citizen and state, about the limits of government power, about what it means to belong to a nation. The Soviet approach treated citizenship as conditional, as something granted by the state and revocable at its pleasure. This stood in stark contrast to liberal democratic traditions that view citizenship as a fundamental right, protected by law and not subject to arbitrary revocation. The fact that modern Russia has explicitly rejected this Soviet practice, enshrining protection against citizenship deprivation in its constitution, suggests a recognition of how corrosive such policies were. Yet the impulse that drove these expulsions has not disappeared. Authoritarian regimes around the world continue to use exile, both formal and informal, as a tool against dissent. Citizenship stripping, though less common than in the Soviet era, still occurs in various contexts. The specific mechanisms may have changed, but the underlying dynamic remains. Governments seeking to silence critics by removing them from the political community, by making them, literally, stateless. The Soviet experience offers a cautionary tale about where such policies lead, about the human cost of treating citizenship as a weapon rather than a right. For those who lived through it, the experience of expulsion left indelible marks. Solzhenitsyn returned to Russia, but remained critical of both Soviet communism and Western liberalism, articulating a vision of Russian identity that drew on Orthodox Christianity and traditional values. Korchnoi competed in chess until his final years, but never fully reconciled with his homeland. Brodsky wrote poetry infused with themes of exile and displacement, exploring what it meant to be cut off from one's linguistic and cultural roots. Trotsky spent his final years trying to build an alternative communist movement, always looking back to the revolution he had helped create and that had ultimately rejected him. The story of Soviet citizenship expulsion is ultimately about power and its limits. The Soviet state possessed enormous coercive capacity, the ability to imprison, exile, or execute those it deemed enemies. But it could not control ideas, could not prevent the works of Solzhenitsyn or Brodsky from reaching readers, could not stop Korchnoi from playing chess at the highest levels, could not erase Trotsky's influence on socialist thought. The expulsions were acts of desperation as much as strength, admissions that the Soviet system could not tolerate even the mildest dissent, that its ideological foundations were too fragile to withstand criticism. In casting out its most creative and independent minds, the USSR diminished itself, depriving Soviet society of the very people who might have helped it evolve and adapt. The consequences of this self-inflicted wound became apparent in the system's eventual collapse, when decades of suppressed criticism finally burst forth and the entire structure crumbled. The expelled dissidents had been proven right, but at tremendous personal cost. Their stories remain a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and a warning about the dangers of treating citizenship as anything less than an inalienable right.